A shift on missile defense, a realistic approach, or a common-sense strategy in difficult times? The US president's decision to shelve a proposed missile defense system for Central Europe is seen by some as reorganizing America's priorities, while others see it as a unilateral concession to Russia. What are the likely implications of Obama's move on the rest of the world? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Maryam Nemazee. It's been described as a huge shift in American foreign and defense policy. President Barack Obama has scrapped his predecessor's missile defense shield based in Eastern Europe, removing a major source of tension between Russia and the United States. In an interview aired on Sunday, President Barack Obama said he hopes his new missile defense plan for Europe, announced on Thursday, will make Russia less paranoid. While admitting that Iran remains the main threat, Obama hinted on Thursday that it's irrational to spend billions of dollars developing an unproven system against a non-existent threat in conditions of economic crisis.
This new ballistic missile defense program will best address the threat posed by Iran's ongoing ballistic missile defense program. It is more comprehensive than the previous program. It deploys capabilities that are proven and cost-effective. We've also repeatedly made clear to Russia that its concerns about our previous missile defense programs were entirely unfounded. Our clear and consistent focus has been the threat posed by Iran's ballistic missile program.
Well, President Obama may have said that it was never a threat to Russia, but the missile defense plans have been a huge diplomatic stumbling block for the two nations. In February 2007, the U.S. started formal talks over stationing part of its defense system in Poland and the Czech Republic. Russia objected and just months later pulled out of a long-standing European arms treaty. Later that year, Russia threatened to site missiles in countries neighboring the EU if the U.S. continued its plans. The then-President Vladimir Putin even suggested Russia could pull out of a 20-year-old nuclear forces treaty with the U.S. In July last year, the U.S. signed an agreement with the Czech Republic. Moscow stated if the deal went ahead, Russia would be forced to act without diplomacy, but with what it called military and technical methods. Then in August, the U.S. struck a deal with Poland. Russia responded, saying Poland was exposing itself to possible nuclear attack by its involvement in the U.S. plan. Now, Prime Minister Vladimir Putin has praised Barack Obama's dropping of the plan as brave. Well, joining us now are our guests in Washington, D.C., Donald Jensen. He's a fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations and a former U.S. inspector of Soviet weaponry. In Moscow, Alexander Pikaev, an advisor to the Russian Parliament's Defense Committee. And in Brussels, Georgi Gotev, a senior editor of the online news site Euactiv. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Mr. Jensen, if I can come to you first. Would you describe this decision as a U.S. concession to Russia? Has the U.S. basically bowed to Russian demands on this issue?
Well, the U.S. administration will tell you that they didn't have Russia in mind. But I think you can't ignore the Russian dimension to the problem. And in that regard, I would say it is a unilateral concession to Russia.
Mr. Pikaev, will this be viewed as a major security concession by the Russians?
No, we do not believe that this is a concession. We know that the Obama administration made a decision based on its understanding of the U.S. interests, and we know also that the decision of the Bush administration to deploy the system created enormous problems for the United States, even in times when the system was not deployed yet.
Georgi Gotev, could we see an improvement in the relationship between the two countries now? Because, as Mr. Pikaev pointed out, Russia was vehemently opposed to former President Bush's plan. It was a major sticking point in bilateral relations.
Certainly, we can speak of a new beginning, and I didn't invent the words. It was NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who is the former Prime Minister of Denmark, who called his own initiative. I think he's taking advantage of this new climate for establishing a new beginning of NATO-Russia relations in a number of fields, and an important one is Afghanistan.
Mr. Jensen, is there a danger that some within the Russian political establishment will see the dropping of the missile defense shield as a sign of weakness and perhaps use it to argue that a hardline Kremlin policy does work? Could we, in fact, see less compromise on some issues that are important to the U.S. from Russia?
Oh, I think that's actually likely to be the case. I think what you've seen here is a, let's say, a dubious decision by the Bush administration to go forward with a system, invest it with a huge amount of political importance, and now see the Obama administration pull back. In my view, this is not primarily a security issue. This is a political issue. And you're sending a message to Ukraine and Georgia, Poland and the Czech Republic, whose leaders have gone a considerable amount to accommodate the U.S. on this. Now the rug has been pulled out from under them, and I think this is going to cause huge problems. To add to comment on what my Moscow colleague just said, Poland and the Czech Republic are in NATO too, and I think they are likely to see this as another example that the U.S. guarantees about their security cannot be trusted.
Mr. Pikaev, what's your take on that this is mainly a political issue, it's got nothing to do with security, that it may not lead to any improvement in relations between the Russia and U.S.?
Well, it's a whole set of questions, but first of all, the plans of the Bush administration to build ballistic missile silos just a few dozen kilometers away from the Russian borders, of course it is both a political and security issue. Regarding Poland and Czech Republic, yes, they are members of the European Union, they are members of NATO, and we don't understand how the missile defense could improve their security, especially in times when, for instance, Czech Republic withdrew the radar agreement from ratification a few months ago, and pending results of the expected parliamentary elections in Czech Republic next October.
But Mr. Pikaev, Russia did at one point say that Poland was exposing itself to possible nuclear attack by its involvement in the U.S. plan.
Well, it depended on Poland. If Poland wanted to deploy American missile, so-called missile shield, well, it should expect Russian countermeasures. Russia never said that it would be nuclear countermeasures, but Russia did say that additional missiles would have to be deployed as a counterweight to possible ballistic missile silos and ballistic missiles to be deployed in Polish territory under the headline of missile shield.
Georgi Gotev, Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, who opposed the missile shield plan, said that Obama's decision was correct and brave. He said the administration had made a responsible move. Could that indicate perhaps that we might see warmer dialogue at the very least between Russia and the U.S.?
I sincerely hope so. I think that the previous project of the Bush administration was over-politicized, and U.S. President Obama has corrected the mistake. I think the study, because the decisions are always based on a thorough study, and the study really was showing that there was no need for developing this missile shield precisely on Polish and Czech territory. And the bottom line is that this is the interest of the United States. Therefore, yes, indeed, Poland and the Czech Republic are disappointed. They feel some frustrations. But overall, it was the right decision, and it was a courageous step taken by the Obama administration.
Mr. Jensen, there's been a lot of speculation that a deal was done behind the scenes which could possibly pave the way for further sanctions against Iran, with Russian cooperation, of course, on the UN Security Council. Does that sound plausible to you?
Well, I hope those discussions have taken place, and I think they may have certainly have taken place in some general way, but I do not think, at least in my conversations with some people in the administration, that there have been concrete Russian quid pro quo with regard to Iran. I think the Obama administration decision has been driven more by hope than substance, and I see little evidence that the Russians want to go as far as the U.S. wants in terms of working with Washington on curtailing the Iran missile program. And I think that is, if the White House thought that they would get more Russian cooperation by acting without a quid pro quo, perhaps that's the case. I hope that's the case, but I don't think it is the case.
Mr. Pikaev, what's your take on that? Because the Obama administration would need support from Russia, which of course has veto power in the United Nations Security Council if they were to increase sanctions on Iran. Any indication that Russia would support such a move?
Well, actually, Russia did support sanctions against Iran since 2006, and Russia supported several UN Security Council resolutions containing sanctions against Iran. Now, Iranians and other 6 powers are going to sit down and talk. Next round for talks is expected for October 1st. And against that environment, there is no need for another sanctions. What we need is to negotiate.
So Russia wouldn't support tougher sanctions on Iran?
Simply, there is no such request. The Obama administration initially wanted to have a special meeting on the UN Security Council on Iran, but last minute it decided not to do so. So at this moment, there is no any request on sanctions.
But what sort of atmosphere does this decision on the part of the US create? The Russians, they haven't made any solid specific commitments to cooperate on the Iran issue, but do you think they will be now more inclined to reciprocate in some way? Russian President Dmitry Medvedev said there is always a score in politics, and if our partners hear some of our concerns, we will of course be more attentive to theirs.
Well, indeed, Russia is ready to cooperate on the broad range of issues, including Iran, including North Korea, including settlement of various regional crises. I think Russia is ready even to cooperate in building up a joint missile defense system, as Chief of Staff of the Russian Armed Forces mentioned earlier today. So I think that cooperation could develop now with the refuse of the Obama administration from the deployment. One of the most irritator in the US-Russian relations has been removed, and I don't see significant obstacles for developing sincere cooperation, including on very sensitive areas like against missile
Georgi
defense.
Gotev, we've heard some very vague statements from Russia and in fact from the US. I mean, no specific commitments of cooperation on any specific issue. Is Barack Obama taking a bit of a gamble here? What happens if Russia doesn't make any specific concessions with regards to Iran, for example? Is it going to look like Obama gave in to Russia without getting anything in return?
No, I don't see it as a gamble. I think that the Russians are eager to reciprocate to openings, and I was listening to the Russian ambassador to NATO, Dmitry Rogozin, last Friday. He was speaking to journalists here in Brussels, and the ambassador was pointing out at the fact that Russia and the United States have the same interests regarding Iran. If Iran develops nuclear weapons, Russia is much closer than the United States. It's also a threat. And I think that it's the change of climate which would allow, indeed, the Russians within established formats such as the NATO-Russia Council to discuss those issues before it was simply impossible to do so. Therefore, no, it's not a gamble. It's not a gamble. I think it's a good timing, and I think that there are realistic chances that East-West relations as a whole will improve in the next months. We should not focus on the problems of the feelings in the Polish, in Poland and in the Czech Republic.
You have a very optimistic view. But Mr. Jensen, if we look at some of the reasons reasons Barack Obama gave for his decision, he said that the latest intelligence indicates that Iran is concentrating on short and medium-range missiles rather than long-range missiles. If we look at this purely from a military strategic point of view, if we leave the politics out of it for a moment, does that make sense to you?
It does make sense to me. As I said, this is the original Bush administration decision was primarily a misguided military decision. But I would also argue that the president cited the current Pentagon Defense Review, which all presidents do, and that came to the conclusion, apparently, that money is better spent elsewhere. But I would also add that the armed services and the Pentagon always argue that and have for 20 years, going back to the Reagan administration. I wanted to add one point to the earlier comment about Iran, which is to say, yes, both the U.S. and Russia have an aversion and a dislike and an opposition to Iran having a viable nuclear weapons program, but there's a lot of diplomatic leverage that Russia can gain by having a no-win, no-lose position, where there is somewhat formal cooperation in the UN on sanctions and other pressure against Tehran, but there's no real backing behind the Russian position, and there's a lot of commercial and other interests that Russia has just by continuing the status quo for a few years.
Georgi Gotev, what about reaction in Central Europe? How might the leaders of Poland and the Czech Republic feel about this, given that they did support the initial projects? Would the leaders of those countries perhaps feel a sense of dismay as though the Obama administration is abandoning them?
Well, I think Eastern Europe as a whole has to reassess its role in NATO. In the previous Bush administration, I think many Eastern European countries thought they had a privileged relation with the United States, and I think it gave a false sense of being above the average, let's say. I think NATO has expanded too much, and membership in NATO does not give to NATO members the assurances that yes, Article 5 will apply and that they will be protected if there is such a need. Therefore, I think the Eastern European countries are going to press for more guarantees for their security, because NATO has a challenge. Russia is becoming more and more assertive, and if the threat is perceived in Central Europe, then the threat must be addressed. This is what is going to happen in the next months.
Alexander Pikaev, Finnish Foreign Minister Alexander Stubb said that the US shift in missile defense policy in Europe may even increase stability in the region. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, definitely, I believe that decision not to deploy this version of the system would greatly enhance stability in Central Europe, in the US-Russian relations, in Russia-NATO relations, inside the European Union, inside NATO, and therefore it could open door for much healthier developments, much healthier dialogues in European continent. It would be really pity if the claims of Poland and like-minded countries for deploying additional US troops in Central Europe would divert the trend and would again bring the region into instability.
Well, okay, Mr. Jensen,
really
I just want to go back to something that Georgi Gotev said about Poland and the Czech Republic asking for more guarantees from NATO in terms of security. Does cancelling the radar system in any way, could it in any way potentially jeopardize security in the region?
Oh, I would look at it a different way. I would say that the price for Poland and the Czech Republic accepting the system to begin with was additional guarantees about their security. And in that sense, Moscow was correct last year when the discussion of the Patriot missiles came up to say that Poland very definitely wanted additional guarantees if they took the missile systems on board, because they don't care about Iran, they care about Russia. I would say, however, that there's one word, the U word, which hasn't been talked about here, and that's Ukraine. I think the great ambiguity in relations between Moscow and Washington, despite the reset button, has been the status, the future of Georgia, Ukraine, as well as the East European new NATO memberships. And I think that is a gray area, and by being a gray area, it's a very dangerous area, because neither side is really quite sure where the boundaries are. Neither side is quite sure how close how much they can pressure to get Ukraine on a more Western path, to get Georgia, perhaps, who knows, after a number of years, going in a more democratic direction toward integration in Europe. These are gray areas, and I don't see that the cancellation decision last week has helped that at all. In fact, I think it's made it even worse.
Georgi Gotev, there has been some concern that the U.S. is perhaps turning away from its traditional allies in Central Europe. The former Polish President Lech Walesa said that it's not that we need the shield, but it's about the way we're treated here.
Well, I think that the traditional allies of NATO are countries like France, Germany, not necessarily the two Central European countries, the names we have pronounced several times. I think that the bottom line is that it should be said that Ukraine will not become NATO member in the foreseeable future, and the same goes with Georgia. I think this is obvious. And of course, these countries want to become part of a prosperous West, but I think the European Union would need to come forward. It will not be NATO anymore, as I think that this path has been explored and it did not function. I even see this war in Georgia, which took place in August last year, as a proof that this policy could not proceed any further. I think that the politicians will continue to say that every country is free to become a NATO member, but in fact these candidacies will remain frozen.
Alexander Pikaev, NATO's new Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen seemed to be pleased with this decision, saying that it was his clear impression that the American plan on missile defense will involve NATO to a higher degree in the future. Could this also bode well for Russia's relations with NATO, or would Russia's perception of NATO expansion into its sphere of influence, if you like, would that need to come to a halt before we could see any improvement in their relations?
Well, it's absolutely clear that the most important stumbling block, the most important problem in Russia-NATO relations is NATO eastward expansion and, in this time, accession of Ukraine and Georgia. I agree that this question might not emerge for several years more, if it would emerge any time soon in the foreseeable future. And given that the major obstacle has been removed or delayed into indefinite future, and I think that nothing prevents Russia and NATO to cooperate in areas of mutual interest like Afghanistan. And let me remind you that recently Russia provided military transit for NATO through its territory. It also provided transit for the United States through its airspace and its railway system. And Russia is ready to cooperate in many other areas, including building up joint missile defense with NATO. And with NATO we had such discussions for more than 10 years.
You say that Russia is willing to cooperate, but again, I come back to this point that we haven't seen any specific commitments on any specific issues from Russia. Mr. Jensen, Konstantin Kosachev, chairman of the International Affairs Committee of Russia's lower house of parliament, said that this is a recognition by the Americans of the rightness of our arguments about the reality of the threat, or rather the lack of one, from Iran's missiles. Finally, the Americans have agreed with us. I mean, is this sort of constructive engagement, this pragmatism on the part of the Obama administration, is it necessarily going to yield any results? Do you think they'll succeed in winning their opponents over?
Well, I agree with Mr. Pikaev that greater cooperation between NATO and Russia is a highly desirable thing. I just don't think that this furthers it very much. I saw the quote that you mentioned. I was very troubled by it, because it's not clear to me that some people in the Kremlin can take yes for an answer on this. But I would also point down the road a little bit, which is to say there are enough people nervous about this decision last week to look very skeptically and closely about what the Kremlin is doing, how it might react. And there are a number of issues down the road, like WTO. I just saw Mr. Shavalov speak a few minutes ago. WTO, which require U.S. cooperation and conciliation. And unless the Russians come back with constructive, serious measures on Iran, most primarily, I think it's going to be a greater difficulty getting a lot of U.S. support for some of these other areas where we hope to cooperate.
Well, thanks very much indeed, gentlemen, for your time. Donald Jensen in Washington, D.C., Alexander Pikaev in Moscow, and in Brussels, Georgi Gotev. Well, thanks so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. Bye for now.